ranked lists. As we always know, that means there'll be no Tribble at all down in the comments section. Hello interwebs, I hope you are all doing well, and by the title of this video, you can tell that it is time for me to be doing my official rankings of Star Trek: The Original Series. Yes, this video I'm going to officially rank my top 10 episodes of The Adventures of Woolly Shats over here in the gang, and I just want to explain to you a little bit of what my thinking is going into creating this video, because this is actually going to be part of a series of videos that I'm going to be doing ranking every episode of Star Trek. Yes, I said every episode because I'm crazy. I'm a crazy person.
Extremely dangerous to himself or to anyone else who might...
But anyways, jokes aside, as many of you know, I am actually going to be having surgery very, very soon. At the time of this recording, I'm going to be having surgery in 2 weeks. By the time you're watching this video, I may have already had the surgery. And so I kind of wanted to do a few videos to kind of bank and have them ready to release after I have the surgery, so that I have a few weeks to sort of recover and don't have to be on camera while my face looks like I just got beat up by somebody. And so with that in mind, I also decided that I wanted to marry it with this idea that I've had going on for a while, in that recently, since the start of the pandemic, I decided to rewatch every single episode of every single Star Trek show. And it's taken me a few years, but we've been in this pandemic for a few years, sadly. And I recently finished that, and while a lot of that has helped inform like other things that I've made, like my Sex and Star Trek series and stuff like that, I figured, you know, it's YouTube. Why not do some ranked lists? So, in order to milk all that content while I'm recovering from surgery, I decided I'm going to make a bunch of different videos ranking episodes from every single Star Trek series. Star Trek The Next Generation as well, Deep Space Nine, Voyager, Enterprise, and then for modern Star Trek, I'm going to rank all of those at the same time, like Strange New Worlds, Discovery, Prodigy, Lower Decks, all that stuff, Picard. Not because any of them are particularly better or worse or anything like that, just because there's so few episodes of each of those shows, because they have much smaller seasons than the rest of these Star Trek shows, that it's just easier to rank them all together and group them all together to actually get a full video out of it. But then, once I do each one of those videos, I'm going to take the top 10, as well as some of the honorable mentions from each video, and put them all in one big gigantic pile, and make one ultimate list of the top 20 Star Trek episodes, in my opinion. So, this is going to be the first of a few videos that you're going to be getting from me. But obviously, with that in mind, just remember that this is a very subjective list, not only for everybody, because ranking is always subjective, but even for myself, because honestly, sitting down to make all of these lists was a little bit of a task and was very difficult. And honestly, if you asked me tomorrow, I probably would have come up with a different top 10 list. So when I mention my honorable mentions later on in this video, just know that honestly, pretty much any of those episodes that I mentioned on my honorable mentions could have entered into the top 10 and probably were considered to be at some point during the process of me thinking about this. So just be aware, but this is what I have settled on for my top 10. Oh, also, I should mention before we get started, on this particular list, I'm also counting Star Trek the Animated Series in the original series, because quite honestly, the animated series is great and is just as equal in quality, if not sometimes more so, than the original series. So the animated series is counting in this list as well. But enough of that preamble out of the way, let's get to the controversial stuff and start ranking Star Trek episodes. Number 10, The Enterprise Incident. This might be probably one of the more controversial entries on this list, because most episodes in Season 3 of the original series have been relegated to just absolute dreck and crap, and there is a lot of dreck in Season 3. And the Enterprise Incident also, even within that, is, while it's considered one of the top of the best of Season 3, is not always surfaced as one of the best episodes of the show. But for me, I particularly really enjoy it, because I always enjoy like a good political intrigue, a storyline, and I love the way that we learn a little bit more about Romulan culture within this. We get our first, and I think only female captain in all of the original series, which is kind of a sad sentence to say. And we also get like Kirk and Spock just kind of having fun messing with the Romulan commander. And we also get some like subterfuge and spy stuff going on here too. Like it's a bit of a messy episode, as most of Season 3 was, but this one was just kind of fun.
Mr. Spock, the doctor has now confirmed your testimony as to the mental state of your captain. He was and is unfit to continue in command of the Enterprise. That duty has now fallen on you.
Number 9, Yesteryear. Like I said, start to the animated series definitely counts for this list, and Yesteryear, quite honestly, is the best of that show. This episode was penned by DC Fontana as a sort of pseudo-sequel to The City on the Edge of Forever, which may or may not appear on this list later on, and it is honestly one of the most heartfelt and emotional storylines from the animated series. It also fit right into DC Fontana's wheelhouse because if you know anything about Fontana, she was one of the best writers for not only Spock, but Vulcan culture. Like, a lot of what Vulcan culture was comes from Fontana, as well as Theodore Sturgeon, who wrote the episode Amok Time. And this episode really just evolves a lot of the iconography that we know about Vulcans today. Like, we get Ichaya, Spock's pet. We get the Forge, which is the Vulcan desert. We get some of the look of Vulcan as well. But it's all wrapped up in a really fun time travel storyline where Spock goes back in time and teaches a lesson about death to his younger self. It's honestly one of the few times that I still cry at Star Trek, and especially the original series. As much as I love the original series, it doesn't always gut punch me in the motions all the time. And Yesteryear is one of the few episodes that actually does that, and it is a true standout. And if you have not watched the animated series, at the very least, you owe yourself to go watch this episode.
Loss of life is to be mourned, but only if the life was wasted. Ichaya's was not.
Number 8, The Devil in the Dark. This is the episode that I think truly speaks to what Star Trek is and what it can say about just the human condition through its alien metaphor. How human beings can sometimes have prejudice against things that we don't understand and we don't fully recognize as fully sentient people because they don't look like us. Like the exploration of the Horta and the ability for crew of the Enterprise and Captain Kirk and Spock to come to understand the Horta as a full sentient being, and the empathy for this very alien-looking creature that this show gives still honestly feels unique today, but was especially unique in science fiction of the time, where it was science fiction of the 1960s was defined by like evil monsters coming to get you. We even saw that in episodes like The Man Trap, one of the first episodes of the original series. So for the show to like actually give empathy to these inhuman-like creatures, I think it really speaks to how Star Trek really tried to have a positive outlook on humanity and humankind, and I truly adore this episode because I think it's just a standout statement on what the power of Star Trek can be.
Sadness. Sadness. For the end of things.
Number 7, Amok Time. I already mentioned earlier on this list episodes that like gave us a lot about Vulcan culture, and Amok Time is like the episode that defined Vulcan culture. This episode does a lot of things that I think speak to Star Trek. Like I've already spoke about in my other videos about how Amok Time kind of has a lot of Gene Roddenberry's proclivities with obsession with alien sex, but how that also like kind of humanizes aliens in a way. Like the ability for us to talk about sex through Spock and how that he handles it and thinks about it really allows us to delve into his psyche. And so I love that we're using things like sexuality and sex to speak about like how we think about people and how people relate to themselves and to their culture. And in some ways, there have been a lot of criticisms of like critique of this episode about how horrifying some of the ways that like Spock sort of feels about his sexuality and how othering it can be. But for me personally, I think just the ways that this episode uses sex to talk about culture and our relationship to it, as well as like some of the ways that you can read like a queer reading into this episode. Like there's definitely something to be said about like the fact that the win of this episode is that Spock doesn't have to have sex, and that he gets to go back with his group of 3 guy friends over on the Enterprise. Like that's the win. Maybe was intentional, maybe wasn't, but it speaks to me personally. And ultimately, I think it's just a really great exercise in creating alien culture and science fiction writing.
Captain. Jim! I'm pleased to see you, Captain. You seem uninjured.
Number 6, Mirror Mirror. The mirror universe, as it's later used throughout Star Trek, can sometimes feel a little bit cartoony and unbelievable. But that being said, the idea of this episode where we sort of look at the possible path that we could go down, like this very authoritarian, very fascistic, very much not believing in infinite diversity and infinite combinations, that sort of juxtaposition with our own hope for the future that Star Trek embodies, I think was a really cool concept for the show to do. And it honestly just leads to a lot of fun. Like, clearly Nichelle Nichols and George Takei and Walter Koenig and everybody are just relishing their roles, getting to play the more cartoonishly over the top, like, fascist versions of themselves. Like, it's honestly a good time. But it also speaks to, like, how even in those dark times, Kirk is able to still, like, inspire others. Like, he's able to inspire Spock to be better, to, like, speak to something more than just power and wanting power. So it's a fun episode, but also, like, still, in the best Star Trekian way, had something to say about paths not taken and how we can still do better even in the darkest timeline.
In every revolution, there's one man with a vision.
Captain Kirk, I shall consider it.
Number 5, Journey to Babel. Again, we have another DC Fontana episode that focuses on Vulcan culture. Journey to Babel is another one of those very important episodes in the entire, like, mythos of the Star Trek universe, because it really kind of started to evoke what the Federation would start to become codified as Star Trek as a franchise continued. This sort of galaxy-spanning multiple alliance of worlds that respects others, respects differences. And yet it's also all wrapped up in a really interesting mystery. But then on top of all of that, we also get a really personal story of Spock and his father Sarek. Like, there is a reason that Sarek comes back so many times throughout Star Trek, whether it be in the movies, whether it be in The Next Generation, whether it be in Star Trek Discovery, is because of how well he is handled here as this father who cannot relate to his son and how distant they are from each other, and yet how much Spock wants to live up to what his father sees in him, like still tries to be the best Vulcan that his father knows he can be, and like the conflict within Spock through his father and his relationship to his father, I think was just so well handled. So just so much done in this one episode, and DC Fontana just knocked it out of the park.
Your father's dying.
Mother, how can you have lived on Vulcan so long, married a Vulcan, raised a son on Vulcan, without understanding what it means to be a Vulcan?
Well, if this is what it means, I don't want to know.
Number 4, The Trouble with Tribbles. As much as I've been like talking about the highfalutin ideas and themes of Star Trek, the original series, sometimes you just want to have fun. And so Troubles with Tribbles is just an absolutely fun, good time. Like, every time you turn on this episode, you're gonna smile. Like, the weird, like, schlocky 1960s campy sci-fi that is just a joy, and just the characters just getting to laugh and have fun and just enjoy themselves. And it's also got a nice little, like, Klingon plot going on there as well. At the end of the day, this episode just showed the versatility of what Star Trek can be. It doesn't always have to be these sort of like high-minded science fiction ideas. It doesn't always have to have a moral to say at the end of the episode. Sometimes it can just be 45 minutes of a lot of fun. And that's what this is. And it still manages to still like be a lot of fun and yet still feel weirdly important. And so at the end of the day, Troubles with Tribbles is just a fun time. And there's a reason that like Star Trek manages to do a lot of really great comedy, and that's because of this episode showed that you can do that with Star Trek.
I gave them to the Klingons, sir.
Gave them to the Klingons?
Aye, sir. Before they went into warp, I transported the whole kit and caboodle into the air engine room, where there'll be no Tribble at all.
Number 3, The Doomsday Machine. This is honestly one of the darkest episodes of the original series. Like, we talk about, like, Deep Space Nine getting dark, but you have the crew of the Enterprise going up against a machine that just seems nigh unstoppable, and you see what could happen to Kirk in the character of Decker, a man who had to face this unspeakable horror, suffered the consequences of it, and broke under the pressure of it, and how Kirk and the crew just having to realize that sometimes, even though you know that you may fail, that there's nothing you can do, you have to face up against these giant existential threats because it is the right thing to do, and because you have to try everything you can to stop the worst from happening. You have to have hope. You can't believe in the no-win scenario. And I think that this episode really kind of gets at that ethos, and also kind of hints at one of the things that I love about Star Trek that we don't really talk about too much, in that there's like these unexplainable eldritch horror mysteries. Like, there are a lot of unexplained things in Star Trek, and I love that because it makes the galaxy seem bigger. Like, we never learned where the Doomsday Machine came from. It was just this giant machine that was gonna kill planets, and we never learned where it came from. We never learned why it wanted to do that. And that just happens. It's the universe. The universe is big, and sometimes you don't always get the answers that you're looking for. So on all those levels, the Doomsday Machine is just a fantastic, yet very dark early entry in the original series.
They say there's no devil, Jim. But there is. Right out of hell, I saw it.
Matt, where's your crew?
On the third planet.
There is no third planet.
Don't you think I know that?
Number 2, The City on the Edge of Forever. All of you probably knew that this episode was going to be on the list somewhere, and probably knew that it was going to be towards the top. And some of you may even get angry at me that it is not number 1. And honestly, if it wasn't for the things that I like about my number 1 on this list, this could have been very close to it, because this is one of those episodes that is very tragic. It will, like Yesteryear, make you cry. And yet, there's still hope in it. This episode just still has that sense of hope and optimism for the future that you always look for and want to see within Star Trek. Even in these tragic moments, we can still hope and believe in the betterment of humanity, that humanity has this bright future. And, you know, right now, today, the time that Edith Keeler was living right before World War II, maybe we won't get it in her lifetime, but we will get there. And that was what this episode was really about for me, that there's tragedy, there's sadness, and the human condition is ultimately never going to be perfect, and yet we can still hope for that better future. And it manages to wrap it all up in a really wonderfully done love story. The Edith Keeler, William Shatner Kirk storyline is the only love interest of the week that I really ever bought and invested in throughout the entirety of the original series. Star Trek didn't really do romance of the week in any show very well. And this is one of the few that actually stands out and works, especially in the original show. And then there's also some cool time travel stuff and iconic things like the Guardian of Forever. This is a seminal classic of the original series.
Time has resumed its shape. All is as it was before. Many such journeys are possible. Let me be your gateway.
But all that being said, before I get to my number 1 on the list, let me go through some episodes that were my honorable mentions. The Counterclock Incident, another classic episode of the animated series that had a really cool, clever, time travel idea in it, and also introduced us to Captain Robert April, Where No Man Has Gone Before. This episode, which was produced as the second pilot for the show, really showcases some of the grand science fiction ideas that this show was trying to tackle. The Galileo 7. This was an early episode that really highlighted and showcased who Spock was as a character, and really indicated that he was going to be the classic icon that he eventually became. The way he looked at the world, this sort of pull between logic and emotion, this constant fight that he had, was sometimes a benefit and sometimes a flaw, and that internal struggle and sometimes external struggle made him such a fascinating character to watch. Space Seed. There is a reason that Khan Noonien Singh came back as one of the main antagonists of one of the best movies of the entire Star Trek franchise, and that's because his appearance here, Ricardo Montalban's performance, is fantastic. Not to mention, this episode also directly targeted ideas of eugenics, which today we don't really think about as super political, even though there's a large undercurrent of eugenics ideology still existing today within white supremacist spaces and stuff. But at the time that this episode released, the idea of eugenics was still just coming off having been a predominant idea in American culture, was still fairly political at the time. The Time Trap. Again, another great episode of Star Trek the Animated Series, and also featured the return of the Klingon Core, who we wouldn't get back again until Deep Space Nine, when he appeared over on that show. And the concept of this episode would actually reappear later on in Star Trek Voyager, with the Enterprise being stuck in a sort of pocket dimension bubble that they needed to work together with other races to try to escape. It did it here first in the animated series. But that brings me to my number 1 spot, and that is Balance of Terror. Balance of Terror, I think, is a fantastic episode. Not only is it a great back and forth sort of submarine battle, but it also showcased us a really great storyline about prejudice, with characters seeing Spock through the lens of the fact that he just looks like a Romulan. That ultimately is just a really cool tete-a-tete between the characters. And while many people will say, rightfully so, that The City on the Edge of Forever is the true standout Star Trek episode, I always just get on the edge of my seat every single time that I watch Balance of Terror. And for me, it is the number 1 episode in Star Trek, the original series, and I adore it.
I regret that we meet in this way. You and I are of a kind. In a different reality, I could have called you friend.
What purpose will it serve to die?
We are creatures of duty, Captain. I've lived my life by it. Just one more duty to perform.
That is my list for the top 10 episodes of Star Trek The Original Series. Next week, we'll be tackling Next Generation, so I look forward to doing that. But before then, I would love to hear all of your thoughts about Star Trek The Original Series. Did you like my list? Do you hate my list? Do you have episodes that you loved? I'd love to hear all that below. Don't forget that all of these episodes, including my honorable mentions, will be put in the pool at the end of this series, where I'll try and judge the top 20 Star Trek episodes of all time. So that's the list that we'll be pulling from. But beyond all of that, thank you so much for watching. Please wish me well, because I'm probably still recovering from my surgery at the time of this recording. So please, if you want to send me well wishes, I'd look for that in the comments as well. But beyond all of that, I hope that you, as always, my friends, live long and prosper.